I just want to end this course with some short reflection on what it has meant for us as humans to be so complex. I kind of picture it like evolution took us and really shot for the stars in a way, like just made us exponentially more complex than anything it had ever created. Complex enough to make novels or religions or sciences. But what is that complexity? So I think of it as like all these moving parts coming together and having to sort of ping off each other or communicate or signal back and forth long enough to be able to produce something that they couldn't on their own. It's kind of like when we talked about the thinking brain and the feeling brain, sort of just hanging out long enough to produce wisdom, which neither could have had individually. So there's no rushing that. It's kind of like there's no rushing art. There's no rushing our process in terms of the mind understanding its experience and moving through that. And there's no simplifying it either. Like all the parts really have to come together and work together and speak together in order to find a larger pattern than they could have found on their own. The thing is, though, that our system won't provide us with the time and resource that requires unless we feel safe. And the main thing that's going to make us feel safe is when we know we are loved and protected. So human connection is essential to allowing our brains to move past the bare essentials of living toward a more complete potential. Like to feel resourced enough by the group that we can focus our internal resources on weaving together all sorts of sensorial and intellectual and emotional information into a more complex understanding of life and a more complex, nuanced response to it as well. When we're alone, we have to be vigilant and ready, and the process of moving toward complexity is neither of those things. It's messy. It's a process. It takes time. So I think about it like, let's say a little girl is dancing through a field and she sees a flower and she stops just to kind of gaze at the flower and experience what that is like. Now, her system couldn't pause for that moment, that sort of, in a way, a complex moment of integrating this experience of beauty into her evolving sense of reality, if she wasn't tethered to the protection and knowing her parents were there, like to watch out for any danger so that she could take her time. I had a client one time that started to cry, and I just had this sudden sense she wouldn't be crying unless I were here. But it's like how I imagined it was like in the olden days when we would have someone stand guard at night over a town. It's like her system in that moment wouldn't have been able to sort of fall apart and kind of become so vulnerable to do what she needed to do, to take that time to find her completion and let herself be off guard and let herself go internally, unless I had been there in some basic fundamental way to protect her boundaries. So that's the kind of support we need to step into or evolve into complexity. It's like the support so that all these moving parts can take their time. There's enough ease in the system that they can really do it right, communicate with each other, to find not only how they're going to exist in harmony, like to make it manageable, but how they can actually produce something that's amazing. So because that complexity is so messy and less like on guard or ready for quick action, it's too vulnerable to do alone. So that's why we need that time and support. The problem is we have all those internal pieces moving inside of us, even if we don't have that time and support. So that's why when our system is more strained, or we're alone or don't have the attachment experiences we need, it's really easy for that complexity to fall into chaos. Here, of course, I'm talking about the child who feels so deeply and needs a parent to hold her steady through a difficult moment. so she can stick in there and learn to stay with herself and to make sense out of her experience. In other words, to stay integrated, so it can feel meaningful rather than overwhelming. I remember this one time when I was in high school and I was starting to become less religious, and yet I really liked that spirituality had this aspect of faith. So I got curious about, well, how can I hold on to this faith piece? And I was eating dinner with Yvonne Agazarian, who was a mentor of my mom's and a kind of grandmother figure to me. And I asked her, what is a secular definition of faith? And she turned to me and said, faith is being willing to sit with the chaos until the pattern emerges. And for me, when I think back to that definition now, I think she was really talking about integration and coming into complexity. That complex pattern that does take time to emerge, and as it is emerging, can feel a bit chaotic. So since she gave me that definition, in some ways, my life has been kind of about following that and understanding this issue of complexity and emergence, and so I sort of see it everywhere. And one of the ways we can really see this is in our work, as we support clients to sit with their chaos. In other words, with all the streams of information coming from inside or from outside in their relationships, and to sit with it long enough so that some integrative, observing part of their brain can slowly find the pattern or meaning out of it all and come to a coherent and organized response. That's complexity, and it's what we strive for in therapy. But that striving for complexity is not new with the arrival of therapy either. It's really like the whole human story in some ways. Yes, half our story is about survival, which is why we so often give up on complexity and go for the simple understanding or the more conservative response like fight or flight. But our history isn't only about wars and fighting. It's also about religion and philosophy and art. It's so painful, both individually or collectively, to move away from complexity through trauma or the ways we lose integration. We fight so hard to get it back. And I love thinking about spirituality or culture as our fight toward complexity. It's like when we sit to listen to a symphony and are flooded with so many individual strands of sound, but they're all coming together in a way that is harmonious. It's like some part of us says, yes, that's me. The poet John O'Donohue said that beauty is not a luxury. And I think he meant that we need things of beauty to help us come back into wholeness or complexity. In an interview, I heard O'Donohue give a definition of beauty, and I liked it and wrote it down. And he said, beauty isn't all about just nice loveliness. Beauty is about more rounded, substantial becoming, an emerging fullness, a kind of homecoming for the enriched memory of your unfolding life. I believe he was saying that all moments of beauty are about integration. I know these points may all seem a little obvious, but I think they're worth slowing down with, because we can be so hard on ourselves. But when we step back and think, okay, we are designed to be so complex that without just the right conditions, we can't stay integrated enough to manage that complexity. And boy, when we can't manage it, it so easily slips from complexity into chaos and so much pain. And yet, when it does slip away, when we fall away, we collectively find so many avenues of return, whether they be art or spirituality or activism, and we try so hard to come back. So I like looking at all those areas because it helps me really love humans. And I think as therapists, it is so important that we love sort of the human race and have a real appreciation for how treacherous it is for us to be sort of the bearers of this level of complexity. How it can lead to really amazing potential, but it's also really understandable why sometimes we struggle. So forgive me for ending on a little inspirational sermon there, but recently I've heard a number of people say that us therapists are the priests or priestesses of our time, and I think there's some real truth in that. It's like we have the sense that if we just hold the container and hold the safety and help them kind of come in contact with a larger resource, a larger pool of resource, in other words, with something greater, then the person's system will naturally organize toward health and beauty, and their self will emerge in ways we couldn't predict. In other words, we help them find their faith.